好，各位听众，大家好。欢迎大家回到今天讲座的现场。好，那接下来的今天的最后的2场讲座呢，我很荣幸能够在这边帮大家主持跟介绍。那因为这2位讲者呢，多少对他们有一点熟悉，他们是非常专业而且非常认真的研究者、学者。那 Ute Bauer 更是在国际上非常有分量，而且这几年对于亚洲的状况有深入的了解的一个很重要的一个策展人。那所以因为今天时间有一点压缩到，我这边不多说，就跟大家介绍一下Ute Bauer 教授。他目前是国立新加坡南洋科技大学中心研究所当代艺术中心，也就是我们知道的 CCA 的创始馆长。那在2013年起呢，他帮这个学校里面的艺术媒体设计学院从事教授授课的工作。那在这之前呢，2012年到2013年，鲍尔教授在伦敦皇家艺术学院担任美术系的系主任。在此之前，他还担任过麻省理工学院视觉美术系担任副教授。那Ute 教授他的这个策展经验跟他的论述经验其实是非常非常的丰富的。那在今天呢，他将会跟我们分享一个他近年来一个非常重要的一个计划，跟大洋跟大航海，甚至于跟这个海洋有非常密切的关系的一个研究。然后甚至他最后做一个策展的案子，在 CCA 呈现了这个展览。那今天很高兴有这个机会可以邀请到 Ute 教授来讲述这个细节的这个专案的细节。那我们现在就邀请 Ute 教授上来跟我们分享。
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks so much, Amy, and also thank you, Mali, and also big congratulations to Mali and Francesco Manacorda for this Biennale, and also I want to thank the museum and its staff for the preparation, but also having the Taipei Biennale every 2 years, and very often with a provocative topic. And I think this time it was particularly touching, and for me, like coming like in the days I was here every day and see people of all walks of life actually engaging with the exhibition. That's not always the case, and hopefully later we also have the time to talk a little bit about maybe also the changed roles of museums as spaces of the public sphere in times when there are not much spaces left where we can have this kind of civic engagement. So I know that also Mali cares a lot about that, so I hope we can talk about that, and it's also something we try to explore with the Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore, which is not a museum, but is a national research center. So, but there I have to explain often to my university with a public face. So I will start. And I also want to thank my distinct colleagues for their papers, and so I think you will see how they interrelate to a certain extent. And I thought it's very interesting to have 2 colleagues who come from literature to see also literature as a potential way of discussing urgencies of our times and adding to a debate that we have today about like what is truth and what are languages of truth. So I thought that was very inspiring to me, and the same counts also for art. What does art contribute in a time when we still fight very often in our universities if this is a legitimate space of knowledge production or is art too speculative, similar to literature. So I think that might also be something we have to debate. What are the languages of truth in these times that we face today? Yeah, I want to start like with also referring or like linking basically to also Tanya and to the speaker before. We have very much a debate today following also the discussions around the Anthropocene. What does it mean to become post-human? And it's really quite important to maybe because of the increasing experience of the impact of climate change and of the impact of anthropocenic action, that we maybe also see that we live not alone on this planet, and we have to discuss are human rights basically before rights of nature, or do we accept finally this planet as a shared habitat, as a shared environment that maybe forces our anthropocentric perspective to shift. And I think it's really, we really understand that the extinction of animals, and we heard this earlier today, really have consequences as much as in recent days also ecocide is considered to be subject to international law tribunals. I think this is really a progress in order to understand also rights of nature, and some of you might hear that also in New Zealand, basically in front of the court, the Maori managed to get a river to be considered as a legal entity. And I think these are debates where we actually stepping into new territories, and the question is, where is the space to have those debates? And so I really, again, congratulate this biennial to bring this to the fore, and it's also amazing to see this collaboration and also maybe juxtaposition between artistic practice, the practice of NGOs, but also how does this relate to policy and environmental and legal kind of like reference systems. And in this respect, I think it's very interesting that particular feminist and queer academics and theorists such as Rosie Braidotti, Donna Haraway, Anat Singh, but also Elizabeth Povinelli, interestingly American academics, are proposing a post-humanist, and Rosie is actually in the Netherlands, but proposing a post-humanity scenario as a positive, as a form of positive transformation. And this proposal goes beyond the anthropocentric worldview by calling for an inclusive understanding of this planet as a shared habitat for all life forms, where the right of nature equals, if not replaces, human rights. Not humanities per se is in crisis, it is rather the dominant anthropocentric perspective that calls for an urgent revision. Donna Haraway proposed as an alternative to the Anthropocene to maybe look into the potential of the Stulocene. And people might wonder, what is a Stulocene? And the Stulocene refers actually to a species. You see here an image of the Piemoa stulu. It's a spider. And she actually looks, maybe we have to understand knowledges are no more that linear, and rather like in a more tentaculous way. As the spider, it goes in different directions, and staying in the trouble, like being always in alertion, like being alert, is maybe a state of our mind we have to be in to really address the urgencies of our times. To stay in our comfort zones might no more be the solution and not an option. So she really looks into our habitat, this planet as a habitat that requires a symbiosis or a making with, rather than autopoiesis, which means self-making. And in her recent book, as I said, Staying with the Trouble, she proposes that we learning to live and to die together on a damaged earth that will prove more conducive to the kind of thinking that would provide the means to building more livable futures for all life forms. Becoming post-human, consequently, is a process of redefining one's sense of attachment and connection to a shared world, a territorial space, may it be urban, social, psychic, ecological, planetary. It expresses multiple ecologies of belonging, while it enacts the transformation of one's sensorial and perceptual coordinates in order to acknowledge the collective nature and outward-bound direction of what we still can call the self. And here I was quoting from Rosie Braidotti, a post-human critical theory in a critical post-humanism and planetary futures that she published in 2016. Yeah, I come, as Amy mentioned before, from several years as an associate professor and also actually the head of the Art, Culture and Technology program at MIT, and our post-nature and post-human debate geared very much around also artificial intelligence, biomechatronics, and you see here two examples. Actually, they came both out of the same unit, our CSAIL, our Computer Science and Artificial Robotics Lab. You see here Big Dog, and it's quite an old robot. And it might be very interesting if you Google on YouTube by Boston Dynamics. So Big Dog is actually outside of MIT. It's a company that develops, as you might guess already, military services. And Big Dog can actually climb steep environments. It can walk on ice, and it is actually yeah, it could be useful for other things, but it mainly comes out of military development. The other part, again, out of CSAIL, is the MIT Personal Robots Group, which was led until recently by Professor Cynthia Brazil, and she developed companion robots such as Nexi. They are planned to engage with children or elderly, so as a learning tool and as a companion. So, but again, it's very interesting, they stem out of the same laboratory. Our group are located in the same building where the Media Lab is located. The Art, Culture and Technology program, which is part of the Visual Arts program at MIT, had other ideas also about the posthuman. So you could see here, for example, a reference to Jae-Rim Lee, one of our alumni. And she works since years on the Infinite Burial Project that engages in green burials together with the burial industry in the United States, which is actually a highly toxic environment for the people working there. Many people working in the funeral industry are exposed to formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen. So it's not only the bodies that are polluted, but it's also the people who are working in this. It's a huge industry, as you can assume, are exposed to toxic environments. So she is actually looking into mushrooms, and so she developed this burial suit that is covered with mushrooms that would help to detox our bodies. Human bodies are actually also a large polluter along with buildings. 30% of the world toxins actually come from buildings, not necessarily from cars. It doesn't mean cars are non-toxic, but there are so many sources of pollution. There is actually no way out, and our bodies are actually, again, also a highly intoxicated body. We collect really a lot of toxin during our lifetime. And basically, mushrooms are detoxins, they are depolluters. And as we know, every farmer knows that, but I think they can also be used in different ways. So Jae-Rim worked on this project, but interestingly, she then also got contacted by NASA to work on this project for space labs, basically where it's a kind of an eco-cycle where the mushrooms, they grow out of body remains, not necessarily also dead bodies, it's like human debris, etc. But then they can also be eaten. It sounds creepy for normal people, but if you work on a space station, it's also a survival tool. So it's very interesting that Jae-Rim, she became afterwards a TED Global Fellow already in 2011, and then she started her own laboratory, in part supported by NASA. Yeah, here we have Anna Löwenhardt-Singh, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Santa Cruz, and her book, The Mushroom of the End of the World, that came out 2015, is actually confirming what was in the very beginning also when Jae-Rim started her project, seen with quite some skepticism even within MIT. But sometimes it sounds odd, but sometimes artists have this speculative capacity. But Jae-Rim also has a background in biology and chemistry, so it is actually quite solid what she does. But I think it takes sometimes years until those speculations get confirmed. And also, what is really interesting also in relation to the show here is the book The Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, Ghosts and Monsters of the Anthropocene, that was published last year, also by Anna Singh, by Heather Ann Swanson, and Elaine Gran, and Niels Burband. So it's really, there is no way back. I mean, we cannot heal this planet, but how can we live on a damaged planet? that is the next step we urgently should engage with. This was a little detour to come actually to the project that Amy was referring to, the Oceanic, which I would call a voyage into the geopolitical and the biophysical of the Pacific. And I'm not an ocean person. I'm German. I come from a country that has not that much ocean exposure. And actually, I was rather distant to the ocean. It to me is a powerful entity that I deal and treat with respect, but it's not necessarily a place where I want to be so deeply involved in personally as a physical body. But if you do these journeys, you have to. So, but why I got approached by TBA, which is a foundation based in Austria and in London. TBA 21 is Thyssen-Bornemisza 21, is founded by a wealthy individual, Francesca von Habsburg, and she uses her heritage on the one side to collect art, but in parallel she always would collect ocean matters in marine protection zones, like because she partially grew up in Kingston in Jamaica, but she never connected the two. And at a certain point she felt she has to connect the both. She felt very uncomfortable on the one side amassing or producing artworks, and then on the other side engaging with the environment, and there is no dialogue. So she said it felt a bit schizophrenic at some time, so she tried to connect the two, not without facing resistance by her own team, who thought like she gets now a little bit in the off, also by others who warned her that her family history as a Thyssen might create complications and questions, which it does, rightfully, but it shouldn't stop her from doing so. So we showed Alan Sekula, Fish Story to be Continued, and those who have seen here the Biennale see some of the chapters. Fish Story, again, when we showed it in Documenta in 2002, it had been already presented before at Witte de Witt, where also the catalog was produced. And so we took over the whole show because we thought it's really very important. I had the honor to work over several years with Alan Sekula before his untimely passing, and I felt to commemorate the second anniversary of his passing that we should actually show this complex project in a city which has one of the largest container harbors in the world. Fish Story engages to a certain extent about a changed notion of labor around harbors, but also on the ocean, which is one of the most unregulated workspaces in the world. And we also showed in addition to newer films, The Lottery of the Sea, that Alan edited in 2006, and then The Forgotten Space from 2011 that he co-directed with Noel Birch, and which was kind of for him a continuation of Fish Story, and this way we also call it Fish Story to be Continued, because also in the Leiden University they continue the research on also Alan's archive and the Dockers Museum that is basically built on his engagement and his research on labor on the global oceans. Interestingly, Francesca von Habsburg owned one of the chapters, and it was very important to get this chapter because it's not so easy to get this kind of works because of Alan's recent passing. The museums were evaluating if they give those works on loan because they cannot be reproduced. Also, Alan Sekula, like Walking on Water, I think that's a chapter that is also to be seen here. He looked into, as I said, the changed notion of labor, like global harbors have high rates of unemployment through the automation in container harbors, and the deep impact that had on cities such as Liverpool or like in Poland. What does that mean? And then working in the Pacific, I also discovered the new labor on the ocean, that is fish factories, mobile fish factories that are on huge ships on the ocean. They don't go on land anymore. They have smaller fleets that very often also illegally are fishing, and then everything is processed already on the ocean and then shipped out. So, and that is really in a very unregulated space because it's global, it's international waters, and very complicated to basically also track what's going on there. Yeah, like this is like a hammerhead crane unloading 40-foot containers from Asian ports. This is in Los Angeles terminal, like closer to Alan's home. He was based in LA and before working and studying in San Diego. And also he really looked into these huge ships, and also, of course, here you see the Rick Riston accent Valdez that was awaiting a trial. And so if we come to the sea law, it's getting very tricky. And also I wanted to show it in this project in Singapore, because actually Alan arrived in Singapore. He couldn't finish this chapter, but he came on a container ship to the Singapore harbor, which I learned from Sam Durant, one of his students, whose father-in-law is based in Singapore. So it was really interesting to also learn about this more hidden story, and we thought it brings also this big project to around, because he would have loved to do something in Singapore with this project. Another project that also we showed at the CCA was Charles Lim Yi Yong Sea State, which was initially, it's his contribution to the Venice Biennial, but actually he worked more than 10 years on this project, and it was shown in various institutions. Like Alan's project is a never-ending kind of story. Those projects are not short-term. These artistic inquiries or artistic researches are usually more than decades long and have different chapters. So it's also very interesting how do collecting entities such as museums deal with ongoing bodies of work that get reshaped, re-edited, reconfigured, etc. And also how do collectors deal with this. Our art world is still very much based on uniqueness, on collectible items, and so, but not so much on process. And I think that's also something to learn from this artist. Also, we just heard Amar Kanwar, The Sovereign Forest, is also an ongoing project. So I think we also have to deal with a changed notion of artistic practice in terms of knowledge production. But also for Lim, the sea is a metaphor for Singapore's geopolitical anxieties as a city-state and as a small city-state that has limited landmass. And again, I think yesterday, like we heard about, like, I think one of the biggest trades in the world is actually sand. We talk always about gold and other rare earths, but actually sand is a big industry, the transportation and exchange of sand, but it also creates a big polluter, as we heard, in terms of it's being embedded in concrete. Yeah, like, but Charles also has been interested in the disappearance of islands and the disappearance of cultural histories, and also therefore cultural ecologies. And one other in the chapter in Sea State 2, he also refers with a buoy that, of course, was no more necessary, because like these islands have become part of Singapore Island, and this chapter is called As Evil Disappears, and evil in that case refers to the Sayahat island, Pulau Sayahat, and Sayahat in Malay means evil. So many of the islands around Singapore are also having haunted names, so they're getting renamed to have a more positive connotation. Usually those islands also come in pairs. So when they get embedded, you lose also this kind of like cultural histories that the older generation still knows, but they still believe those islands and those parts are haunted. So also this is very interesting. And what Charles did, he collected one of the buoys, like he constructed one of those buoys, and in order to give them their state, they had to be sunken into the ocean in front of Singapore and overgrown with barnacles. And then he not only exhibited those buoy in the Venice Biennale, but he also brought it to our space. And you can imagine the smell in our museum when the buoy, the barnacles, and all the worms that eat the dead barnacles kind of like release their kind of, like smells. So it looks very clean and very artificial in the museum, but the smell was immense. He also looks into the engineering of our nature and of islands and of oceans. We always see ocean as a contrast to kind of like inhabited landmass, but also oceans are very engineered. I mean, we heard also yesterday and today about noise pollution in the ocean. All our Wi-Fi cables, telephone cables are like transported through the ocean. The oceans are as much culture and civic spaces as is nature on our landmass. It's actually completely interwoven. We can't separate them really anymore. And here in Sea State Phase 1, Charles Lim also looked into the fast underwater kind of like storages, also for oil, the palm oil industry, but also for liquid gas to support Singapore's electricity. Basically, he was visiting while they were still not filled, when they were still in their construction state, and he filmed that, and it's really, I mean, it's worse than a James Bond kind of like situation. But to come to the current, in the current, I was invited to visit to do 3 expeditions with artists, scientists, and so to different places in the Pacific, which felt very strange to me. And to go, for example, on the first trip to Papua New Guinea felt very alien, actually, and I felt very weird. It's almost like a neo-colonizing effort, like in arriving on those islands, and we really had to negotiate a different kind of exchange with the people on site. And here, for example, we were stuck. This is the Dardanella, which is the vessel that we used. So I was stunned to learn that only 5% of the oceans are actually charted and mapped. 95% of ocean floor is not charted. So most of the time we couldn't go when there were storms, because this region is uncharted. We couldn't go at night. And then very quickly all these boats usually would arrive. Like some of the kids, they came 3 hours with their dugouts to trade stuff, and so I don't know how they sail those currents. But there is very deep knowledge of the oceans. There is a symbiotic life with the ocean, and also the indigenous population that we met on all of our voyages. They said for them the difference between air, land, and ocean doesn't exist. They don't even have terms for that. Is one term. It's basically, it's their world, it's their cosmology. They don't separate. Also in the Tuamotus, on our second trip, we were a little bit better prepared. We basically went there on the 50th anniversary of the nuclear tests in French Polynesia. A fact that is stunning, that France never apologized until today for the 193 nuclear tests that had devastating impact on both nature and the people living there. And Tuamotus, which is the French Polynesian name for, it's the Polynesian name for distant islands, is also the reason why in this region, not only in French Polynesia, but on the Marshall Islands, the Bikini Islands, nuclear tests took place, because they were a little bit in an unseen area, so they could also go to a certain extent undetected. And the people there still fight for their rights in terms of their medical histories. All the files were taken back to France when France military moved out of the region, and this is why we tried to do an interview with an atoll that is no more inhabited with human beings, and those kind of projects we would also show basically in the oceanic. Our last exhibition took us to Fiji, because in Polynesia they told us the word tapu actually is an oceanic name, it's a Polynesian name, and the tapus were established to protect, it was established usually by a chief, to protect land in order that it's not overgrown, or to protect fish in areas that they're not overfished, or also as other sacred kind of like rituals when a chief is dying. So we actually had, again, the honor to be part of establishing an open ocean marine sanctuary, a tabu, together with the local chief, Paramount Chief Rocco Sau of the Totoya Islands, because he needed a ship. He didn't have a ship to do that. So we had a ship, so we could join forces. So it's also actually what can you do together. And when we said, oh, in the beginning we come to learn from the Pacific, they said, that's great for you, but we actually don't want to share. I mean, what are you bringing to us? What can we do together? It's always nice, you want to learn from the global south, but what is left for us? Then you even walk away with that knowledge. So I think the modalities of exchange are very critical. And to come back also to what I spoke yesterday with Wuma Lee, artistic expression is not limited to art institutions, and civic knowledge shouldn't be staying outside of the museum. So I think we need more permeable and more porous kind of like exchanges between those knowledges. And what was very interesting to me, of course, we also in the aftermath we also worked with other institutions such as the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica, but also together with Davo Vidas, who is part of the International Law of the Sea Committee. And what was very stunning, as what we learned with Davo Vidas, for example, only in 1994 the court that is regulating international law of the sea and international seas in terms of seabed mining got only established in 1994, fairly recent, and it really gets very active only since a few years when the technology is as far that you can do open ocean seabed mining, which is very stunning. Now, of course, it became a very popular entity, but what was very stunning to me is also when I learned from Davor that the international law of the sea is still based on the Mare Librum by the Dutch jurist and philosopher Hugo Grotius, who was writing this law of the sea, like this Mare Liberum, in 1606, and only at the turn of the last century it got translated from Latin into English, but was never published. And in English it's only available since 2004. Before it was only available in Latin, and it's still the foundation for the international law of the sea. So if you go through that, you feel a little bit like in a criminal novel, because you can't believe that this is really the case. I mean, like, so the ocean is still a very unregulated space, and it's very interesting that also the law of the sea, basically from Grotius to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, that is on the foundation for the International Seabed Authority, for example, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, just recently made its way to a wider public. Yeah, and then in the oceanic, we tried to bring together basically the projects, the artistic projects of these journeys. We tried to do the Kula Ring, which was the point of departure for the first journey, a collective body of knowledge, didn't work out that well in the beginning with the artists. They really had difficulties. I mean, we discussed this. Can you share for 2 weeks your knowledge, your way of working with everybody? Don't claim ownership. It was very, very hard for the artists to give up. They're kind of like, for 2 weeks, to give up their properties. And these are even friends of mine. So in the oceanic, it was still kind of individual works, and now slowly we are actually engaging in more collaborative project. It really took years to get there, so this project is not ending, but we rather try to put up questions like who are the regulators of the global ocean, who owns the ocean, etc. And so the different projects, like from the first one dealing with ocean species, to a Greenford, who is also represented in this biennial, worked on jellyfish, which are some of the oldest species of this globe and very less studied. So he engages in this. And then in Linke, for example, he collaborated with 2 German oceanic institutes with their deep water recordings that are actually done to study ocean habitats in order before they do seabed mining or ocean exploiting. But all of these videos go in a huge storage. They are never visible to anybody. So what he tried to do is to make those films kind of visible. He's a filmmaker, and he was very interested in the imagery that these scientists produce into more than 5,000 meter depths in our oceans, and where they discover on each journey new species. And he thinks also if we can make this more visible, there's also more awareness about the dangers of ocean pollution, ocean noise, and ocean mining. Yeah, here you see some of the species in deep water. Is quite stunning what you discover there, like the beauty that is in the deep oceans is completely unseen and unknown to us, but we already mingle and interfere in irreversible kind of action in the oceans. Yeah, and here also like one of the artists, Lisa Rabe, she worked on a film, it's called Europium, and it's about the exploitation in Papua New Guinea in the Bismarck Sea, where we had our first expedition to eliminate rare earths, like called europium, which you have in almost each of your banknotes. It helps to make them to detect fake banknotes. So it's kind of like how to say, like it's a bioluminescent kind of like property. And it's exploited in the deep sea, and ironically they call the project to exploit those rare earths Nautilus, which is one of the oldest shell forms and one of the most perfect shell forms. So, and then also Nabil Ahmed, who was on the second journey, he embarked on a longer term project which is called the Inter-Pacific Ring Tribunal that collaborates with Marshall Islanders, but also people from French Polynesia, and also in West Papua, the independence movement, in order to protect oceans and land from mining, acidification, and other devastating impacts. And they tried to basically, in collaboration with the lawyers we met at the Seabed Authority, they tried to bring this forward to really support the notion of ecocide as a legal crime. And so I think it's very interesting how this artist, in collaboration with NGOs and legal entities, but also policy makers, embark on a collective effort to really protect this planet, and also to share this and collaborate with indigenous communities who are part of that. It's not for them, it is with them, which is very, very crucial. But the research Nabil did in the global oceans, if you see what is dumped in there, just along the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Rim, is just shocking. And again, it goes pretty much unnoticed from the public. And what was very interesting, we also, for the convening in Singapore, we had the Minister of Water and Environment, Mr. Masagos Zulkifli, as a guest of honor. There is a project called the Small Island Groups in the Pacific that is in sleep since a few years. So they started to look back into that on the occasion of our convening. But we also got approached by the former president of Kiribati, His Excellency Anote Tong, if he can give a talk at our space, and he did the closing ceremony. And when we told him we only have 80 seats, we are maybe a little bit too small for him. I mean, he's really very well known in terms of the COP, the climate change conferences. He works together with Al Gore on global environmental initiatives. And he was very kind and said, like, when it was good enough for your minister, it's good enough for me. And actually NOS, they refused to, and my university, they refused to give him a bigger auditorium, which again is quite shocking. So we had the pleasure to have him there and to talk to him. And I know we are at the end. I think we have to culminate in terms of time. I had a project, but you can look it actually up. It's on YouTube, Ocean Calling, which is by performance by Laura Anderson Barbata, who was, it's not the United Nations Oceans Day, it's the Ocean Day. And she was part of our first expedition to Papua New Guinea. And for the Ocean Day at the United Nations, they developed also a performance to really address in a different way the delegates who work on global ocean regulations.
This year.
Yeah, like you can see it online, it's on YouTube. But I also want to come back to Mali's question to me yesterday. Yes, museums can serve as witnesses and they can serve as archives. You see here a detail of Hieronymus Bosch, The Temptation of St. Anthony, which is of the Museum of Art at Kansas City. And if you look up the Hieronymus Bosch paintings, they are pretty much already you see the posthuman kind of like debate already like more than like in the 1500s, in the medieval times. So they had pretty much an idea about like the devastation that happens to our planet. It's not something new. I think we rediscover it, and as I say, like if we dig into archives and museums, we maybe see a little bit more what we might expect if we don't continue to engage together for the survival of this planet. So thank you very much.